welcome to today's CBI 10 webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm an editor at a new startup called Tortoise. Great pleasure to be here with a sort of, I think, a sort of back to school feel still in the air, this, middle of September. So we're going to spend a bit of time this morning looking forward to some of the big moments coming up in the term ahead. And there's quite a few of them actually. There's the autumn budget, spending review, the winter plan on COVID, and a whole sort of movable feast of changes to EU customs. More on that later on. So a ton of stuff and a great panel of CBI experts to help us navigate it all. We've got John Foster, who's Chief Campaign Director. We've got Nicola Hetherington, who's Principal Policy Advisor, great expert on the EU negotiations. And we've got Louise Hellam, who's Director of Economic Policy for the CBI. So there we are. As ever on these calls, will be wonderful to have your questions, your observations about the labour market, about skills shortages, about EU customs, about friction in trade, about whatever you want. We've got people here who can pick up on any or all of those themes. I think it always helps the CBI, certainly helps us on these webinars to feel like we've got our ears to the ground. We can hear directly from the people who are trying to deal with all these big issues as they come. So please do questions, observations, put them into the chat. If you want to put something in anonymously, then of course just write ANON at the top of it, and we'll deal with that in confidence. But we would, anonymously or openly, we would love to hear from you. It really helps the conversation. But John, let's kick off, and let me kick off with you, if I may. Given, as we always do on these calls, a sort of roundup of what's on your plate at the moment. What are the big business issues that the CBI is working on right now?
Yeah, of course. Morning, Kerry. It's great to be back in the hot seat. Morning, everyone. So today's webinar is the first in a bit of a new format for us we're going to run. So what I'm going to do this morning is try and cover some of the top political insights and activities over the past couple of weeks or so. I do a quick cant around the course. I think Nicola's going to cover off EU customs, as you mentioned, and Louise is going to pick up budget, CSR, that kind of piece. As Kerry mentioned, colleagues, if you have any broader questions on your mind, please do feed them in. We will certainly do our best to answer. So from my side of the house, Kerry, I think there are probably three top issues for firms right now. COVID, reactions to yesterday's winter plan, labour shortages. We know this is such a prominent issue for many firms. And then I'll just finish with some thoughts on business investment to try and tee up Louise a bit. So Kerry, I'll just start with yesterday's publication of the winter plan. I'll kind of run through what's in it and what we think is missing. Now, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, set out the government's plan A to manage the country through the coming months. He spoke about trying to sustain the gains of the vaccine, but he also announced a contingency, a plan B, in case further measures are needed to control the spread of infection and obviously to support the NHS. Now, plan A consists of 5 pillars in total, and I'll just run through those very briefly. Pillar number 1 is building defences through vaccines, antivirals and therapeutics. There's lots of bits and bobs underneath this pillar. Probably the most important element is offering booster doses to vulnerable individuals from next week. So if you're over 50 and above, you're going to be in line for a booster vaccine. Pillar number 2 is continuing to identify and isolate positive cases to limit transmission. Now, this means continued use of test, trace and isolation, that particular system. Good news is though, PCR testing will remain free for those who have symptoms, and also we will see the continued free provision of lateral flow test, really important for firms. Excuse me. Pillar number 3 is supporting the NHS and social care. So that includes the big cash injection announced last week, but also an expanded rollout of the flu vaccination programme. Now, number 4 is probably what's most relevant for firms. And this focuses on advising how people can protect themselves and others through clear guidance and comms. So this is really narrowing in on encouraging the behaviours to prevent the spread of the virus. So for people, that means doing things we've all been doing for many months now, opening windows, meeting outside, regular testing. For firms, that means monitoring and improving ventilation, for example, using CO2 monitors, but it also means possibly considering the use of COVID status passes in certain scenarios. Fifth and final pillar, Kerry, is pursuing an international approach, where again, the most relevant bit for businesses here will be the revised framework for international travel that the government will set out in the next few days. Now, if the data suggests the NHS is likely to come under unsustainable pressure, the government has prepared in its back pocket a plan B. Now, what the Health Secretary said yesterday is that they're confident that these measures won't have to include lockdowns and social distancing. They also said the measures won't be introduced at once. Instead, they prefer to deploy them on a kind of sliding scale. And I'll run through what that looks like. So that starts right at the bottom with clear and urgent comms about the increased risk. The aim here is to encourage people to behave more cautiously. Next on the ladder will be the introduction of mandatory vaccine-only COVID status certifications in certain settings, nightclubs, indoor venues, that kind of piece. Third would be the legal mandating of face coverings, again, in certain scenarios. And then finally, top of the scale, asking people once again to work from home if they can for a limited period. Now, in terms of what's missing, Kerry, there's not much on testing capacity. Big question, will the government be able to cope with the surge that is inevitably going to be triggered by cold and flu season? There's nothing on a test to release scheme for those people who aren't double vaccinated. And there's also limited detail on when Plan B measures could come in. Final point for me on this, there's also a bit of a worrying lack of appreciation for the complexity that firms will face if they have to implement some of these measures really quickly. So yesterday, Chris Whitty warned that those COVID status certificates could be introduced at what he described as very short notice. Now, we'll be having rapid conversations with government in the coming days and weeks. So as ever, your feedback is really welcome. Questions in the chat, or please do use the coronavirus inbox. Excuse me. Just moving on to labour shortages now. We made a really significant intervention last Monday. And I think just 2 points for the top of the house here, Kerry. So firstly, this isn't an isolated problem for a handful of sectors. This is widespread across the economy. Of course, it's HGV drivers, the impact that's having on supply chains, but this is chefs, welders, carpenters, butchers, perhaps not candlestick makers, but you get the idea. This is broad and across the piece. Secondly, this is a problem that's not going to fix itself in the short run. We are talking about 2 years, not 2 months. Now, as we were discussing just before we came on, the government is pretty adamant that the end of furlough will do the heavy lifting here. I've got to say, we strongly disagree for a number of reasons. Firstly, furlough isn't free. Businesses are already contributing at cost. That suggests that these are roles firms intend to keep. Secondly, many of these shortages existed pre-pandemic. HGV drivers, there was 60,000 shortage before the pandemic. It's up to 100,000 now. It's not a new problem. And then finally, there's actually a big geographic mismatch between where people live and where the vacancies are. So the example that we get, really sadly, lots of staff made redundant in the international travel sector, but they don't necessarily live near parts of the country with high levels of shortages. Now, in terms of solutions, there's stuff for government to do, and of course, there's stuff for business to do. Now, from the government side, we think they need to step in and act right now. Cannot afford to simply wait and see. They can make investment in training easier. They can flex the apprenticeship levy so firms can divert funds to train more people in these areas. They can target the lifetime skills guarantee and that kind of piece as well. But more pressing and immediate would be to use the immigration powers they have at their disposal just to deliver a bit of flexibility. And that means immediately updating the shortage occupation list and treating shortages in skilled HGV drivers as you would do for shortages in any other skilled workforce. And then for business, Kerry, there's obviously a really important role that we collectively can play by stepping up. That means investing in training, investing in digital automation, and using efforts to appeal to a wider talent pool as possible by really pushing that D&I agenda. And then just to finish, Kerry, bit of an update on a really big speech Tony gave on Monday, a couple of days ago, on business investment. Now, the backdrop to this, something Louise may well touch on, is clearly the announcement about the rise in national insurance. So Monday's speech was really all about setting the tone for the autumn fiscal events that, as I mentioned, Louise will pick up. Now, we were looking to do 3 things with this speech. So firstly, we really wanted to sound a warning that after the consumer spending boom just starts to tail off, the UK's prospects for growth are going to get a bit more tricky, and the government has to use the coming months to really change that. Secondly, we all need now a laser focus on business investment. We have fallen behind the pack internationally. So over the next 4 years, UK investment is due to average 3.4% of GDP compared to the States, 4.1, Canada, 5.9, China, 9%. Now, by the end of 2022, business investment will still be 5% below pre-COVID levels. So the government really needs to persuade global investors and companies that business is ready to compete. That starts with investment. And then finally, Kerry, we need the government to act now to go for growth. And there are 4 proposals that we put forward. Top of the pile, stop raising business tax and instead use tax incentives to reward companies who invest. Secondly, start investing in the skills that we need to compete in these growth markets. Third, invest in areas like renewable energy. Otherwise, we will fall behind our international competitors. And then finally, crowd in the private sector to do most of the work in new markets. You can do that through changing regulations, standing behind these new markets like offshore wind, and publishing the final details of how these markets will work. I'll just close, Kerry, by saying, listen, the government is doing lots of good stuff. There's lots of consultation, lots of published strategies, lots of great high ambition. But there's not enough detail and there's not enough speed for boardrooms to make investment decisions. And we have 6 weeks to change all of that. And that is going to be our laser focus in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, John, thank you. I'll come to Louise in a second, but John, let me just pick up on one thing you mentioned there, which is the idea of the government change immigration regulations to allow greater ability, for example, to recruit more HGV drivers. My impression from outside is they've been pretty opposed to that thus far. Is that a wait and see until furlough unwinds, and then maybe you might see more flexibility from the government, or do you expect that hard line to continue?
I mean, we would hope that they would show greater flexibility. I think to date, Kerry, they've been very reluctant to do so. It's obviously intrinsically linked to Brexit and obviously the control that the UK now has over our immigration system. I think the message that we've been delivering is use that control effectively. This restrictive system we have at the moment is actually inhibiting our international competitiveness. It's been a drag on the recovery. So now we have control, now we have the flexibility. Yes, let's use it accordingly. And that's certainly the message that we'll be continuing to push in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I can see actually Amanda Zambon in the chat asking a question which is similar to what I asked you about whether you anticipate a change of heart on the government's part there, but maybe we'll get some other questions on that as well. Okay, John, thanks for now. Let me come to Louise. And Louise, let me pick up on where John pointed us, that laser focus on investment. What's, in broad terms, what would you say the CBI's case is for more investment in the UK? How do you make us look like a good bet?
Thanks, Kerry, and good morning, everybody. I mean, I think that's the really key question here is and Tony, like you say, outlined in his speech that he said out on Monday, that the UK is in a great place, but actually we need to do better, and there is a risk that we fall behind global competitors, particularly when we're looking at new emerging technologies in terms of green investment and AI. Business investment is really key to this, and actually the autumn period I think is really an inflection point where the government has got choice as to whether it falls back into those old patterns of kind of tax and austerity, and we're worryingly perhaps seeing signs of that already in terms of the NICs increase that comes on top of large corporation tax increases for businesses. So they've got that road that they can continue to go down, and we know that has led in the past to austerity and really low levels of productivity for the UK, or they've got a choice where we can forge a new growth story. And as we said, business investment really is the key to that. So at the moment, growth is rebounding after the pandemic, although we know that it's still a bumpy road for some sectors, but consumers really have generally saved and are now spending again. that relying on that consumption growth isn't a balanced recovery. And so unless investment improves, that strong growth will be really short-lived. So low business investment in the UK, as John said, is a really long-running issue. So we consistently been at the bottom of the G7, and currently business investment is 15% below pre-pandemic as well. But we've got this opportunity, like we say, to really kickstart a virtuous circle where we can say higher investment in the UK to lead to higher sales and profits, more jobs and demand, in turn enabling more investment, and we go round and round. And we think that's really the answer. Instead of more tax rises and austerity, thinking about investing in growth, increasing productivity, and seeing increasing living standards and fiscal sustainability. And I think one of the really key things for that, as John said, if we tackle these four areas that will enable UK firms to really boost their own investment, is those the same four areas that international investors are looking for the UK as well. So I think we've got a double win here. We can both unleash that investment in the UK, but continue to make sure that the UK is a great place to invest too.
Okay, and I have to say, if you are running a company, you run the numbers on last week's national insurance increases, and you've got an idea of whether that is going to influence your ability to invest, I'd love to hear from you in the chat just about how you're thinking about all those things. So please do. But I guess, Louise, in broad terms, if the CBI is pointing the government over here and saying, we need the conditions in which businesses can invest more, in which companies in the UK look like good candidates for inward investment. Last week's announcement on national insurance did sort of point the other way, didn't it? So arguably not a brilliant sign that the government is on the same page as the CBI in what the conditions are that are going to create that kind of extra investment.
Yeah, and I think that's why we see this autumn as a really key period, because the Chancellor and the PM have got a really difficult set of choices. We're obviously coming out of COVID. We've not only got the budget this autumn, but a 3-year CSR as well, a spending review, which we've been waiting for quite a long time, as well as really key moments like COP26, and there's a global investment summit next month as well. And I think talking to ministers and senior government colleagues as well, they're really conscious that government have only got 8 quarters left as well. So since 2019, they've been wrestling with Brexit and then COVID. This is a really key opportunity for them to set out their stall this autumn. They've still got quite bold ambitions left for Parliament, especially around net zero, where we really need to see a bold set of measures. And I think, again, we've got this question about the balance of the cost for that in terms of government, business and consumers as well. And again, another big area that we might expect to see something for over this autumn is around levelling up, where we get to see the strategy and exactly what that means. I think, we've heard so much about it, but there just isn't enough detail on that for businesses to really get behind it and invest. And again, difficult political decisions potentially on UC as well. And I think, as we saw with the Nix announcement and the social care package, what that demonstrates is, against all these choices, we've got this conflict between particularly the PM and the Chancellor, but within the Conservative Party, about what kind of state they want to see and what kind of party they want to be, in terms of, the Chancellor being more fiscally conservative and the PM really wanting to make quite bold statements and put a lot of public money behind. So it's that kind of tension potentially between the more red wall Conservatives and the kind of traditional right wing of the party as well. So we expect that the Chancellor will set out his fiscal rules as part of the budget package, and they're likely to see debt falling. And that means that the spending envelopes will remain quite tight, especially for those departments that aren't protected, like health, education and defence as well. So like I say, I think that this is a really key inflection point. We will make the argument very strongly to government, and the initial reactions that we've had to the speech on Monday have actually been quite positive, in terms of the government have got a real choice here, and they could go for that kind of tax and austerity cycle, or we could actually make a real difference, and businesses really stand ready to invest. But we just need those 4 key enablers, those unblockers, to happen to unleash that potential.
Okay, and if the government were to press the button on those 4 key enablers, as you say, what what then is how should business respond? How does business support a positive government move to enable investment, like as you described?
So I think perhaps it might be worthwhile. I can go through some of the things that we've asked for across each of those 4 enablers, and I think it's where again we're looking at instances where we've been talking to members around investment that they're looking to bring forward, but they've been blocked by some of these in terms of some of the disincentives perhaps in the tax system, or the fact that, like we say, there were those kind of strategies out there that just don't have the kind of detail that they need. But across the budget submission and comprehensive spending review submission that we put into Treasury last week, and which will be doing more work on and publishing it at the end of this week as well. What we've done is we've really used those 4 cross-cutting enablers against the CBI's own Seize the Moment themes, which I know that we've spoken about before, but particularly focusing on skills, net zero, innovation. And one of the key things with those as well is that they really dock into the government's own plan for growth. So it's thinking about talking in their language. How can we show that businesses can really unlock the ambition that the government has? And really it's only private sector investment that's going to do that. So the first one of those enablers that John talked about was around smart taxation. So the current system really needs to be better aligned to those priorities of government and actually reward businesses that choose to invest, whether in people, place or planet. So I won't run through all the kind of budget aspect, and just wanted to kind of pick up on, say, there's a big package of measures that we put forward in terms of greening the tax system, so supporting the government's net zero agenda and supporting entrepreneurship and innovation through tax as well, particularly around R&D tax credits and removing the bank surcharge. Really big areas as well in terms of creating a tax system that incentivizes investment. So one of the key areas that we've pushed on for a long time is the overdue reform of the business rate system, which the government are looking at this autumn. So we expect announcements on that, and where that really does hold back high streets. And in particular, there's a really perverse disincentive for firms who actually invest in greening their businesses and then are liable for higher business rates liability. So really, let's remove those disincentives and make sure we don't have that perverse system. The second area was on skills, where we think we really need to see that unlocking of business investment in skills through, for example, fundamental reform of the apprenticeship levy. And again, as we talked about earlier, an immediate support to tackle skill shortages, that update of the shortage occupation list, and for that to be renewed annually as well, so it's a much more flexible system. Those 2 areas in particular around skills and tax, so the kind of bread and butter things that we expect for any budget and CSR, but we've got the 2 areas as well that we think will really be key for unlocking those new markets. So it's particularly that third area around catalytic public investment, so where only public intervention can make the difference and really unlock that private sector investment. So particularly on net zero, looking for a comprehensive long-term package of funding to make our buildings more energy efficient, and also provide long-term funding to decarbonise the transport systems as well. And the government also has a very bold ambition, which is very welcome, to increase direct domestic R&D funding. They seem to be potentially wavering on this in terms of the time frame, so really calling for them to make sure that they stick to that, and if anything, to actually front load that spending so that we can really unleash that business investment as soon as possible. And the final area is around igniting the government as the market maker. So again, where business have got that confidence that they need to really invest, where they need that clarity, the certainty, the long-term commitments as well. So lots of strategies we talked about that need the detail, especially on decarbonisation. We've been waiting for a long time for the hydrogen strategy, and that was announced earlier this month, but we just got more consultations from it again. So again, thinking about the speed that we can get those out and provide the certainty that people need. And again, levelling up, as we talked about, where, we're yet to have a strategy on what exactly that really means. And a particular area for the CBI there, where we think that we can support the government's agenda there, and we're doing lots of work that, again, I'm sure that we've talked about with members before on economic clusters, and really writing the playbook for that, about how that can go from good to great. And I think that's a really key area that we can work on with government to deliver as well. And then the final area I'll just touch on is around economic regulators as well. So they play a really big role in those sectors. And at the moment, there's a lot of focus on short-term price competitiveness over those long-term investment outcomes as well. So calling for all regulators to prioritise investment, in innovation and net zero as well as part of their core remit. So like I say, that's the very kind of quick run through. There's lots and lots in the budget package, but it's really meeting those bold ambitions of government, saying, you know, yes, they are the right areas, business are behind you, but these are the things that we really need to do to unlock investment. And just thanks again to all our members, because, you know, these measures are the result of lots of consultations and insights from them across all our councils and working groups as well. And like we say, we're looking to really push this with the government across the autumn. And just in those early days of sending this in, we've had a really positive reaction from them as well so far.
Okay, Louise, I need to come to Nicola in a minute to talk about customs and trade, but I've just had a question in from Matt Houlihan, which relates to something you just said. So let me just put that to you before I go to Nicola. So this is from Matt Houlihan, who says, what tools should the government be using to incentivise business investment in favour of levelling up agenda? Do you feel like you've got enough granular detail on the levelling up agenda to answer that, or
I think that's actually the key question, Kerry, and thanks for that. Right, that yeah, we just don't really know, I think, about, you know, what the government really means by levelling up and what their agenda is. I think one of the key things that the CBI can do, coming together with businesses and local governments, is thinking about some of those areas of specialism with the UK, being that convening power, and really thinking about where are those businesses that can help. Sorry, I think John wants to come in, but just those local businesses that can help those others in their area as well, and really, like we say, make sure that we can turn those clusters into kind of from good to great as well. But I'll let John come in on that one.
off you go, John.
Sorry, Louise, there's no easy way of doing a physical hand. Digital hands are much more subtle. Matt, it's a cracking question. I think sort of top of our wish list would be changing the business rate system. So in Tony's speech, he spoke about sort of 50% of investments being subject to business rate increases. It's effectively a tax on investment. And part of the levelling up agenda for this government is clearly going to be, how do you rejuvenate the high streets? You can't do that if you've got a business rate system that is punitive to firms that are trying to take steps to improve and invest, etc. So I guess top of our wish list will be business rates. You'll probably hear more from us on that in the run up to the budget and the CSR. If anyone has any live case studies, examples, wants to kind of hitch their wagon alongside us, then please do get in touch. We're really keen to do so.
Brilliant. Okay, Nicola, thank you for being patient. Let's come to you, because this is important stuff. The EU customs regulation seemed to be a sort of splendidly movable feast, and it moved again yesterday. So just talk us through what happened yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. So perhaps not surprisingly, but also a little bit surprisingly, it was announced yesterday that the kind of border operating model, the stage customs controls that were phased into this year, have been extended again. So and this is specifically for EU goods coming into Great Britain. So what we're going to see here is obviously specifically really for kind of particularly food products and plant products, but the requirement for pre-notification of agri-food imports will be could be introduced on the 1st of January 2022, as opposed to 1st of October, so it would have been in 2 weeks. We're also seeing the new requirements for kind of export health certificates, which were again due to be introduced in 2 weeks, now going to be pushed back all the way to next July. And also, I think particularly important, phytosanitary certificates, so SBS checks and certification on particular goods, so like kind of like food and meat products, for example, will now be introduced on next July as well as safety and security declarations. So these are all kind of quite technical, quite kind of specific kinds of kind of customs controls, but I think they're very important, and but now they've been pushed back again. This is the second time that they have been. And I think when we're thinking about why this decision has been taken, I think I've got kind of two hats on as such. if I've got my generous hat on, I think we can say this is now part of like a packages and measures that include Northern Ireland, the announcement of Northern Ireland a couple of weeks ago on the unilateral extension for protocol, essentially kind of as a measure, kind of a lot of standstill measures that they're introduced to kind of relieve the pressures kind of both kind of UK and EU trade, particularly Northern Ireland. And I think it does kind of help some businesses who are in a difficult space through supply chains, particularly going into the Christmas periods. And obviously just to kind of, this all links in with the kind of labour market shortages, and particularly in the HGV and logistics kind of sectors, kind of like, and all the challenges around the costs associated with that. If we were also seeing these introduction of these new checks, these new certifications in the next few months, it would almost be like a kind of perfect storm of kind of additional costs and pressures of going into, obviously the Christmas period is so busy for food producers and kind of in retailers as well. However, if I've got my cynical hat on, which I sometimes like to kind of bring out of it, I think we can say that sometimes it looks almost like the government isn't quite ready to implement their own full kind of deal that they negotiated. These checks were kind of these choices to have these checks, the lack of alignment with the EU because of obviously political kind of decision from the UK when it was going into negotiations, but then they aren't now implementing it. And so why are these decisions being taken if politically that's not what the UK government wants? Could it be the fact that the infrastructure isn't ready quite at the border yet to actually kind of physically do all these checks? Do they have the kind of the staff ready? Obviously, you need new customs agents to process this. You need vets to process these as well. So among all the kind of labour market shortages that we're seeing at the moment, is that also a big challenge? I think that's kind of like a big backdrop and kind of into what's going on. So I think, in short, these extensions can be welcome, but also it's not also doesn't also solve the long-term issues. And I think that's kind of one of the key things that we're kind of looking at the moment. The guidance isn't fully out there, so we don't have all of the technical details, but it's going to be published very soon. And so once it is, we'll be making sure to kind of update our website and our transition hub, which has all of the information about trade with the EU at the moment. So as soon as we get that, we'll be having that ready and shared with all businesses.
Okay. Nicola, I don't know how many hats you've got, but I wonder if you've got like a really cynical one that says that the government might be worried about something trivial as food at Christmas, and maybe they think this might help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure the Prime Minister wants to make sure that there's turkeys on every table going into Christmas. I think it's definitely something that they'll have on their minds. It's definitely the line that they are taking, and this could definitely help with imports. However, what it does also do is it puts UK producers at a disadvantage because they are exporting to the EU under facing the full whack of all of these controls already. They have been since January. So what it means is that they're kind of there's an asymmetrical trading conditions here. So they're exporting all these full checks, these costs, etc. But while EU businesses are now exporting into the UK, into GB specifically, sorry, and they're not facing that. And so there's kind of like a market distortion potentially going on here that will now go on into next summer. So that's 18 months after the implementation of the TCA as such.
Yeah, and if you touched on this and said it wouldn't solve it in the long term, but if the aim in the short term is to avoid some of the stresses on the supply chain, how effective is this delay going to be in avoiding those stresses in the short term?
It's quite hard to say, honestly, because we don't know. It was very hard to kind of guess what businesses' readiness was for both the original kind of classification changes that would have happened in October, and then the checks that would have been introduced in January, just because it's something that is kind of a lot harder to measure than perhaps going back to the days of preparing for either a deal or a no deal and kind of readiness on that. So I think it does go some way to just sort of reducing those initial costs. Some of those businesses will have already spent quite a lot of money on getting prepared for October and for January, and so those businesses won't have been kind of saved much money on that level, but it can essentially take some of the pressure off in the meantime. In the long term, there is potentially a long-term solution to actually resolving much of the challenges with implementing these changes, and that is veterinary agreements. That is an additional agreement between the UK and the EU to recognise each other's standards on animal and plant health that would remove the a kind of initial burden of having to physically check these goods. So checking lamb, for example, if it was being exported. Politically, both the UK and the EU have got very different approaches to what that would mean to actually negotiate that. And so there has not been much progress on it, despite some initial kind of impetus in the summer of what we can do. But I still believe that I think looking at now the UK and the EU are being much more pragmatic when it comes to these conversations with each other on this. So we are hopeful that even if perhaps this kind of extra time doesn't buy us the full amount of kind of time that we'd need to negotiate something like this, it does give some space for these conversations to start happening.
Yeah, and we know that, don't we, that a lot of businesses have spent a lot of time and effort getting ready for these changes that were supposed to come on October the 1st. Broadly speaking, would you expect most of those businesses to welcome the extra time, or will some of them have spent a lot of money on certain costs that will kick in on October the 1st? What, you know, even though this delay is now in the pipeline.
It varies different sector, different if you're a distributor as opposed to an importer. So it'll probably benefit importers, but not so much on kind of on other sectors or other kind of people in the supply chain. So it'll kind of really vary. I know, for example, food producers are not that pleased potentially some of this, but retailers might be kind of more welcoming of the situation for them. So it'll really vary. I think for example, if you're kind of getting your supply chain sorted, you've got all your certification sorted, if you've employed vets to kind of take to do all the checks that you'll need to export it, then you've already spent that money, and that's not cheap to do so. So I think that, and also it's only 2 weeks away, these changes would have been implemented. So if we'd had perhaps more advanced notice on these kind of planned changes, then they would have been able to kind of manage those adaptation, those costs better. But unfortunately, as is the way with all things Brexit and EU trade, there's always last minute changes and deadlines are pushed back. So it's a long tradition, unfortunately, for the government's approach to this.
Yeah. We had a comment in from Ian McKinney that I'll come to you with, John, if I may, who agrees with Nicola entirely. The extensions are not a solution, they're a sticking plaster. As a business in Northern Ireland, we're at the sharp end of the cost admin headaches that the new rules are causing. There was very little business readiness for this, and the uncertainty that remains is most unhelpful. I think it's that uncertainty point that a lot of businesses will echo, isn't it, John? That to Nicola's final point there, 2 weeks is really not a long time to throw the cards up in the air again, and it raises the fear that this could happen the next time and the time after that if things don't get in better order.
It does, and Nicola's point is absolutely right, that this is the approach the government has taken time and time again. If you remember in the build-up to initially preparations for no deal, they were very firm that they were going to stick to the deadline. The jeopardy was something that was designed to force firms to take action and prepare. Now, if every time you approach a deadline, you push it back, of course you lose some of that jeopardy. The incentive for firms, particularly smaller businesses, to take that deadline seriously dilutes quite quickly. On the flip side, those firms that have actively planned, have spent money doing so, and now aren't required to put it in. You will have noticed possibly in the media, 2 CBI members, the NFU, the Food and Drink Federation, actually saying this isn't very helpful. Our members have spent an awful lot of time and money trying to get ready for this, and now you've pushed the deadline back. Nicola and Ian are absolutely right. It's a stick in plaster solution. We've got to use the time effectively. Nicola's point around a veterinary agreement is spot on. But to Nicola's great little line about turkeys on the table, the other part of this jigsaw puzzle is the shortage of HGV drivers, right? So there's no point in actually creating flex in the system if you don't address some of the labour shortages that are already there to help with that supply chain. I've got no doubt Ian in Northern Ireland will have experience of that really acutely. So there's lots of different parts of this, Kerry, that need to be taken in the round. What the government's done is bought itself some time. Let's really hope they use that time effectively to get the right solutions in place.
Okay, Louise, let me come back to you for a second. An easy question first of all, then a more difficult one perhaps. Easy question from Jeff Noon, who's asked on the chat whether the CBI budget and CSR submissions are published anywhere, because he wants to write his own and it would be useful to link to the CBI submissions in some areas.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Thanks, Jeff, for the question. I was just going to type a reply in the chat, but it's helpful to come back on here. So we'll be making those available at the end of the week, and we'll definitely send the link around to those. And really great, yeah, if link your own submission to that as well and really get behind this agenda, that's great.
Okay, and then we talked a little bit about the budget earlier. I just wanted to sort of tuck into the CSR, the Comprehensive Spending Review, as well? Because I suppose the announcements last week on social care, NHS funding, and that was a sort of budget-sized announcement on its own. So I wonder whether the budget feels a slightly smaller sort of thing on the horizon now. But the CSR, something we haven't talked about so much. A 3-year plan. What usefully can the CBI and its members feed into something on that kind of scale?
Yeah, so I should clarify that what we've done this year, because we previously were expecting, and has now been announced, that the budget and the CSR will be on the same day, is we've combined our ask for that, so we can look across both the tax and the spend. So the measures that I talked about today really cover both the budget aspect, which is primarily on the tax side, and then the other areas, particularly around the skills and the public investment that we need to see. That's kind of focus on the comprehensive spending review. But I mean, as you said, last week we almost saw a kind of mini budget, mini CSR, and I think actually that social care package will be the big thing, and we'll have it confirmed. But that really is, I think, where a lot of the new money might potentially go, and it will mean, like I say, that there'll be quite tight spending agreements for the other areas. But I think that's again where we have to make the argument that actually, when we have these measures to unlock investment, that is the benefit for the long term, and we shouldn't think about this really kind of short-term fiscal consolidation and think about going back to that pattern of tax and austerity. We actually need to double down now and think about investing for that longer term. Otherwise, we're just going to keep going on this low growth, low productivity track.
Yeah. So in that sense, is the CBI's submission to the budget and to the CSR, because the CSR presumably is a chance to be more strategic, what kind of country do we want to be in 3 or 4 years? How does that change your input to the CSR?
So I think that's particularly why we have this kind of big tone of like this autumn is the time to make those decisions, and particularly, like you say, because the spending review this time around is a 3-year one. So we've had a series of 1 year where the government just hasn't been able to take its breath almost to make those big strategic decisions, having to deal with Brexit and COVID. And so that's why we think this autumn really is the critical time for them to do that and set out the remaining policy, like we say, over those next 8 quarters of the Parliament.
All right. John, I want to just come back to you because we need to give you a chance from that sort of strategic thing to talk about something much more day-to-day, which is the party conferences that are coming up. But I think still an important focus for CBI to make its voice heard. So what are the plans there?
Thanks, Kerry. So party conference in person, can you believe it? So we're heading down to Brighton for Labour and Manchester for the Conservatives. There'll be a combination of myself, Matthew Rains. If you see us looking lost or forlorn, do come and say hello, colleagues. It'd be nice to see you all in person. So as ever, we're doing a sort of fringe event, but we're also doing a new reception at the Conservatives. So I think I'm right, Monday the 27th of September, we've got our Labour Party reception with Rachel Reeves, hosted and sponsored by the Building Society Association. So Robin, who runs their patch, will be there. Big thank you to him. At the Conservatives, we're then also doing a panel discussion with Andrew Griffith, I believe. Again, the BSA will be there with Robin, but also sponsored by Sage, so a big thanks to them. And then we're doing something new this year, Kerry. So we are co-sponsoring with Onward, the think tank, very associated with the Conservative Party, a reception on the Tuesday evening. Our guest speaker, not sure if I'm supposed to reveal, but I'm going to do it anyways, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. There'll be lots of special advisors, there'll be journalists about. So do come, have a drink, listen to the Health Secretary, come and say hello. I think Alice will just pop in the chat how you can register for any of those events, but I do hope to see a few of you there.
Great. Okay, listen, I think we are now running out of time. I'm just going to throw a tricky one from to you, Louise, just in the final seconds we've got. Only throwing to you because it's got your name on it in the chat. It comes from Nabil Irshad, who says, what's your sense of whether the UK government would be interested in proposing something like helicopter money to support post-COVID recovery in the upcoming autumn budget? Northern Ireland recently announced giving each citizen £100 to create a multiplier effect. Some councils are considering smaller scale schemes. Any sense of whether the government's interested in helicopters and dropping money out of them?
Oh, what a question to end on. So I mean, I think that's a really great question, and I know that it's happened in Northern Ireland and lots of other countries as well. I think that was particularly the case when we were in the thick of the pandemic, and where we did really worry about spending and making sure that we could have that bounce back. Actually, if we're looking at the vast majority of sectors at the moment and that headline economic data, actually things are coming back quite strongly, and actually we have this issue instead, like we've been talking about, in terms of labour shortages and inputs as well. So I don't think that's necessarily something that the government would look to, but and fingers crossed, obviously it won't happen, but if we were to have any resurgence in COVID, then that might be something that they could look at into the future. But I think the moment has passed for that in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, okay, I think you're right in the sense that that's a desperate measure for desperate times, and it's not necessarily terrible news if we're beyond it. So thank you for that. Thank you to everyone who's taken part today. Thank you for your contributions to the chat. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you to Nicola, to Louise, and to John. Do register for the party conference receptions that John mentioned. Alice is saying in the chat that anybody with a conference pass can attend fringe events at both conferences, so they're quite open. Thanks for your time today. Look forward to seeing you next Monday. Bye for now.